It was September 19th, 1944, and the air over Musterbusch, a quiet, broken village on the German frontier, hung thick with the damp chill of approaching autumn. For Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole, the cold he felt seemed to seep deeper than the weather. It was a bone-deep premonition, a hunter's instinct honed not in the forests of Europe, but in the sprawling, sun-baked farmlands of Texas. He sat perched in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman, the third to bear the jaunty, optimistic name, In the Mood. The name felt like a relic from another lifetime, a ghost of the carefree confidence they once had. They were, by any measure, living legends, a specter of battlefield folklore made real. Poole and his crew, his pups, as he called them, were arguably the most effective armored team in the entire U.S. Army. In just 81 days of relentless combat, they had reportedly destroyed or disabled 258 enemy vehicles, captured over 1,000 German soldiers, and fought in 21 separate major engagements. They had become the tip of the spear for the 3rd Armored Division, the spearhead division itself. They didn't just fight, they consumed the German war machine, leaving a trail of shattered steel from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. This mythic status had now become a gilded cage. They had survived the destruction of 2 previous tanks, walking away from burning steel that should have been their tomb. First, a Panzerfaust ambush in the nightmarish hedgerows of France. Second, a catastrophic case of friendly fire from an American P-38 Lightning. Each time, they had emerged from the fire and smoke, not just alive, but seemingly unbreakable. To the fresh-faced replacements and the exhausted veterans alike, Poole and his men seemed immortal, and that was the problem. Immortality was a curse, for it invited fate to prove it wrong. The High Command had finally taken notice. The orders that came down that morning were unnervingly clear. Sergeant Poole and his crew were to be pulled from the vanguard. Their run was over. They were too valuable as a symbol, a propaganda tool for war-bond drives back home, to be risked any further. Their final assignment was supposed to be a milk run, a simple patrol on the flank, clearing a village that was already believed to be secured. It was a task for green crews, not for the deadliest tank ace in American history. The orders were explicit: stay safe, avoid direct engagement, and wait for your relief. But Lafayette Poole knew a truth forged in the crucible of constant, close-quarters combat. A truth that no desk-bound general, miles from the front, could ever fully grasp. Safety, he was fond of saying, is an illusion. There was no such thing as a safe place on a battlefield. There was only the place you controlled, and the place you didn't. To stop moving, to believe you were secure, was to die. He scanned the quiet street of Musterbusch. Too quiet. The rubble-strewn lanes, the skeletal remains of houses with their vacant, staring windows, it all felt wrong. A farmer knows the silence of a field waiting for rain, and the unnatural stillness of a field where a predator lies hidden. This was the latter. Every instinct, sharpened by months of survival, where a single mistake meant instant annihilation, screamed that they were being watched. He could almost feel the crosshairs sweeping over his tank, feel the cold, calculating gaze of a German gunner waiting for the perfect shot. He glanced down into the turret. His men were a reflection of his own tension, a finely tuned machine where each part sensed the vibrations of the others. Corporal Wilbert, Baby Richards, sat at the driver's controls, his hands resting lightly on the levers, ready to make the 33-ton beast dance at a word. In the gunner's seat was a replacement, Private First Class Paul Kenneth King, his face a mask of concentration. The original gunner, Willis Oler, had been reassigned just days before a stroke of luck or a cruel twist of fate. No one could yet say. Below, Technician 5th Grade Delbert, Jailbird Boggs, the loader, and Private First Class Bertrand Schoolboy, Close, the bow gunner, were in their own worlds of tense readiness. They were more than a crew. They were a family forged in fire. They had learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's actions, until training became pure instinct. They had seen the absolute worst of war together, and had survived through a lethal combination of skill, aggression, and an almost supernatural degree of luck. But Poole knew that luck, like ammunition, was a finite resource, and he felt their supply was running dangerously low. The conflict churning inside him was a silent war of its own. His duty was to follow orders, to keep his men safe as commanded. But his instinct, the very core of the man who had brought them this far, was to trust his gut. And his gut was telling him to turn the hell around, to slam the Sherman into reverse and get out of this perfectly laid trap. To obey the command was to ignore the evidence of his own senses. To trust his senses was to disobey a direct order on what was supposed to be his last day of combat. This wasn't just another mission. For Poole, it felt like a final exam, a test of everything he had learned from the boxing rings of Texas to the killing fields of France. In boxing, he had learned from a punishing defeat at the hands of Joe Louis that raw aggression was not enough. It had to be guided by strategy and discipline. In Normandy, he had learned that American technology was often inferior to German engineering, and that victory depended not on the thickness of one's armor, but on the courage and cohesion of the men inside. He had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought every Panther and Tiger tank that had dared to cross his path. He had survived his enemies, and even survived his allies. But how do you fight a feeling? How do you attack an unnerving silence? The weight of his own legend pressed down on him. The war daddy, the man who always charged forward, who always attacked, was now ordered to be passive. He felt like a caged predator, stripped of his most vital weapons, momentum and aggression. The silence of Musterbusch was not peace. It was the held breath of an ambush. He had led his men through hell and brought them out alive. Time and again. Now, on the verge of going home, of fulfilling the promise he had made to his wife, Evelyn, in countless letters, he was faced with the most dangerous enemy of all, a false sense of security. Why did he, the most successful tank commander in the United States Army, feel like he was willingly driving his family into a perfectly prepared kill zone? What was it about this specific place, on this specific day, that felt like a reckoning? Something lethal was waiting for them in the quiet grey ruins of Musterbusch, and the deepest, most terrifying part of his premonition was the chilling certainty that this time their luck had finally run out. To understand the man who made the German panzer divisions tremble, you have to leave the blood-soaked soil of Europe and travel back to the unforgiving dust of Scurry County, Texas. Lafayette Poole was not born a soldier. He was a product of the American earth, a farmer's son who understood the language of machinery and the rhythm of the seasons long before he ever learned the cadence of a military march. His childhood was one of hard labor under a relentless sun, where character was forged not in a classroom, but in the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. He learned to drive a tractor before he could legally drive a car, mastering the brute force of a combustion engine to bend the land to his will. This was his first command, a rumbling, steel beast that responded to his touch. But beneath the quiet, hard-working exterior of the Texas farm boy, a fire burned. It was a restless, aggressive energy that couldn't be fully contained by the sprawling horizon. He found an outlet for it in the raw, disciplined violence of the boxing ring. In the local amateur circuit, he became known for his ferocity. He was strong, relentless, and possessed a seemingly bottomless well of stamina built from years of farm work. He wasn't the most polished fighter, but he was often the most determined, overwhelming his opponents with pure, unbridled aggression. He was winning, and he came to believe that this was the only ingredient necessary for victory. Then came the lesson that would define his life. In 1938, while training for the Golden Gloves, Poole was given the opportunity of a lifetime. A sparring session with the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, the legendary Joe Louis. To the young Texan, this was more than a fight. It was a chance to test his raw power against the very best. He stepped into the ring that day, believing his aggression was his greatest asset. He stepped out a profoundly different man. The fight, if one could call it that, was a brutal education. Poole, relying on his usual strategy, charged forward, throwing a flurry of powerful but predictable punches. Joe Louis, the brown bomber, didn't just absorb the attack. He dismantled it with an almost serene efficiency. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his power, parrying Poole's wild swings and answering with short, precise jabs that felt like jolts of electricity. Poole couldn't land a clean hit. It was like punching water. Only the water punched back with the force of a battering ram. Louis wasn't just stronger, he was smarter. He used Poole's own momentum against him, exposing his defenses and methodically breaking him down. Beaten and humbled, Poole experienced a moment of profound clarity amidst the sweat and pain. He realized that his raw aggression was a blunt instrument. Joe Louis, on the other hand, wielded his aggression like a surgeon's scalpel. Every move had a purpose. Every punch was a calculated response. He didn't just fight, he thought. He controlled the space, dictated the pace, and exploited every opening with lethal precision. Poole learned the single most important tactical lesson of his life in that ring. Aggression without discipline is just noise. True deadliness comes from controlled, intelligent, and relentless application of force. It wasn't about being the toughest. It was about being the smartest fighter in the fight. This revelation became the bedrock of his military philosophy when he enlisted in the army in 1941. While other recruits were simply learning to follow orders, Poole was already thinking like a commander. He saw the M4 Sherman tank not as a fortress, but as a mobile weapon system, a heavyweight boxer on treads. He understood that its success depended on more than the thickness of its armor or the caliber of its gun. It depended on speed, maneuverability, and most importantly, the seamless coordination of the men inside. He wasn't just training to be a tanker. He was training to lead a team that could think and act as one brutally efficient entity. But there was another dimension to his drive, a force that both sharpened his focus and created a constant, gnawing conflict within him. Her name was Evelyn Wright. They married just before he shipped out, and she became the anchor of his tumultuous world. In his letters home, the hardened persona of the soldier would melt away. He wasn't War Daddy or Sergeant Poole. He was just Leif, a husband who wrote of his dreams for a future after the war, a small business, a family, a return to the quiet life he had left behind. This duality defined him. On the one hand, he was a warrior, honing the lessons of the boxing ring to become an avatar of destruction on the battlefield. He drilled his crew with a relentless intensity, pushing them to a state where training became instinct, because he knew that was the only way to survive. On the other hand, every kill he made, every risk he took, was a step on the long road back to Evelyn. His promise to return to her was the fuel for his fight. But his aggressive, forward-charging tactics seemed to mock that very promise with every engagement. He had to be the most reckless and dangerous man on the field in order to be the one who survived to keep his promise. It was a terrible paradox, a constant battle between his will to live and the methods required to do so. And so, the boy who learned to tame the Texas soil, the fighter who learned strategy from a humbling defeat, and the husband who longed for home, all merged into one man. He had found the formula, the raw power of the farm tractor, the disciplined aggression of a champion boxer, and the unwavering motivation of a man fighting for his future. The question was no longer whether he had the tools to be a great tank commander. The question was, how could a farm boy who learned a lesson from a single boxing match possibly use it to create a tactical doctrine that would outsmart and outfight the most feared armored legions the world had ever seen? The hedgerows of Normandy would provide the answer. The legend of War Daddy Poole was not forged alone. A commander is nothing without his crew. And the 4 men who served under him were not merely subordinates. They were the synchronized components of a single, lethal organism. He called them the pups, a term of endearment that belied their ferocity. Through thousands of hours of grueling, repetitive training stateside, Poole had molded them into an extension of his own will, a crew that operated less on spoken commands and more on shared instinct. They were a 5-headed fighter in a 33-ton steel body. At the controls was Corporal Wilbert "Baby" Richards, a driver of prodigious talent. To him, The Sherman wasn't a lumbering beast of war, it was a finely tuned instrument. His touch on the levers was delicate and precise, allowing him to coax maneuvers from the tank that other drivers wouldn't dare attempt. He could navigate treacherous terrain at speed, pivot on a dime to expose a target, and use the landscape for cover with an artist's intuition. He was the feet of their fighter, providing the agility that made Poole's aggressive tactics possible. Behind the main gun sat the original gunner, Corporal Willis, Groundhog, Oler. He was the calm center of their storm. Where Poole was fire and aggression, Oler was ice and methodical precision. In the chaotic heart of a firefight, with shells screaming and machine guns chattering, Oler's heart rate seemed to drop. His movements were unhurried, his calculations swift, his aim unerring. He was the cold, calculating eyes of their hunter, capable of landing a 75mm shell on a moving target from hundreds of yards away. Powering the gun was technician 5th grade Delbert, Jailbird Boggs, the loader. Boggs was the muscle and the heartbeat of the tank, a man defined by relentless endurance. Loading a shell into the breech of a Sherman was a physically punishing job, requiring strength and speed in a cramped, violently lurching space. Boggs could do it faster than almost anyone, his powerful arms ramming shell after shell, allowing In the Mood to achieve a rate of fire that often stunned their opponents. He gave them their overwhelming punch, the sheer volume of fire that could suppress an enemy position or finish a crippled tank. And rounding out the team was Private First Class Bertrand Schoolboy Close, the assistant driver and bow gunner. Often the first to spot a threat, he was the vigilant nerve ending of the crew, his eyes constantly scanning, his machine gun ready to protect their flanks. Together, they named their first M4, Sherman, In the Mood, after the wildly popular Glenn Miller swing anthem. The name was a perfect encapsulation of the American spirit in 1944. Optimistic, energetic, and a little bit defiant. It was a piece of home they carried with them into battle. A declaration that even in the face of death, they were here to do a job with confidence and style. Their trial by fire came in the nightmarish landscape of Normandy. After surviving the D-Day landings, they were plunged into the brutal, close-quarters combat of the Bocage, the infamous hedgerows of France. This was a tanker's hell, a maze of ancient earthen walls, thick with tangled vegetation, limiting visibility to mere yards. It was a landscape that negated the American advantage in numbers and air power, turning every advance into a potential ambush. German anti-tank teams and Panzerfausts could be hiding behind any corner, waiting for the telltale rumble of an approaching Sherman. It happened on the night of June 29th, near the French village of Villiers-Fossard. They were probing forward in the dark, the familiar tension a knot in every man's stomach. One moment, they were a predator moving through the shadows. The next, a blinding flash and a deafening explosion ripped through the night. A Panzerfaust rocket, fired from near point-blank range, slammed into their tank. The world dissolved into a concussive roar, the acrid smell of cordite, and the terrifying sound of sheared metal. The hit ignited a fire, and the dreaded command every tanker fears was shouted, "Bail out." They scrambled out of the hatches, escaping the inferno that had been their steel home just seconds before. They were alive, miraculously unharmed, but shaken to their core. Watching, In the Mood, burn against the night sky was a humbling, terrifying lesson. They were not invincible. Their tank was just a machine, and machines could be broken. In that moment, they were no longer a legendary crew. They were 5 scared soldiers, stripped of their weapon and their confidence, alone in enemy territory. But defeat is a crucible. For some, it breaks them. For others, it burns away their impurities, leaving only hardened steel. For Poole and his pups, this baptism by fire forged an even stronger bond. They had faced death together and walked away. The fear was real, but so was their trust in each other. When the army issued them a new tank, a slightly upgunned M4A 176W model with a more potent 76mm cannon, they didn't hesitate. With fresh resolve, they once again painted the name "In the Mood" on the barrel of their gun. It was more than just a name now. It was a symbol of their resilience. They had been knocked down, but they were getting back up, smarter, angrier, and far more dangerous than before. They were no longer the green crew that had landed on Omaha Beach. They had learned the bitter realities of combat in the most unforgiving way possible. They understood their tank's weaknesses, and they now knew the enemy's tactics intimately. The loss of their first Sherman wasn't the end of their story. It was the violent, fiery birth of their legend. They were no longer just soldiers following orders. They were now hunters, driven by a cold fury and a shared determination to settle the score, having survived their own fiery demise. What kind of weapon had this fledgling crew now become? And how would they unleash their newfound vengeance upon the German panzers that lay waiting in the labyrinth ahead? By August of 1944, Poole and his crew had become a finely honed weapon of war. They moved through the French countryside with a lethal confidence, a rolling testament to the power of tactics over technology. Their reputation preceded them, a whisper of dread among the German panzer crews, and a cheer of relief for the American infantrymen they supported. The crew of In the Mood had mastered their deadly craft. They felt, if not invincible, then at least untouchable. They had faced the enemy's best, and had not only survived, but triumphed. They had developed a soldier's faith not in God or in fate, but in their own skill and in the unwavering competence of the men fighting beside them. That faith was about to be shattered in the most inconceivable way. The incident occurred near the town of Fromental. It was a chaotic, fluid battle space, with pockets of fierce resistance amidst a general German retreat. Poole and his crew were advancing as part of a larger armored column, clearing the way for the infantry. It was a textbook operation, the kind they had performed dozens of times. The sky above was a welcome, brilliant blue, the domain of the Allied air forces, a comforting symbol of American dominance. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the familiar cacophony of battle, the high-pitched whine of a diving aircraft. Every tanker's head instinctively looked up. A silhouette appeared against the sun, its twin boom tail and distinctive shape immediately recognizable. It was a P-38. Lightning, one of their own. A winged symbol of safety, the airborne cavalry coming to the rescue. A wave of relief likely washed over the column. Air support made their dangerous job significantly easier. But the relief curdled into confusion, and then into pure, stomach-dropping horror. The P-38 wasn't strafing German positions ahead of them. It was diving directly on them. The sun glinted off the dark objects detaching from its wings. Bombs. For a surreal moment, the mind refuses to process the impossible. It had to be a mistake. A terrible, unbelievable mistake. There was no time to react. The world vanished in a cataclysm of fire, earth, and shrapnel. A 500-pound American bomb detonated perilously close to the right side of their Sherman. The concussion was a physical blow. A giant's fist that lifted the 33-ton tank and slammed it back to the earth. Inside, the crew was thrown about like dice in a cup. Steel groaned and shrieked. A fire erupted instantly, thick, acrid smoke filling the compartment. For the second time in their combat career, the frantic, desperate cry of "Bail out" echoed in their ears. They scrambled from the hatches, gasping in the smoke-filled air, their bodies bruised, their ears ringing from the violent blast. They tumbled to the ground and looked back at their magnificent machine. The second In the Mood was a mangled, burning wreck, crippled not by a German 88 or a hidden Panzerfaust, but by the careless hand of an ally. The fire that consumed their tank was not the color of enemy hate, but of friendly blue. The psychological impact was more devastating than any physical wound. The first loss to a Panzerfaust was a lesson in enemy tactics. This was a lesson in the cruel, blind absurdity of war itself. The anger that rose in them was a white-hot, directionless fury. Who did they scream at? Who did they curse? The pilot, a distant speck, already disappearing into the blue sky, was not an enemy. He was a fellow American, a brother in arms who had, through the lethal confusion known as the fog of war, just tried to kill them. In that moment, their trust in the larger system, in the grand, coordinated machine of the Allied war effort, burned to ash along with their tank. The feeling of betrayal was profound. They had put their lives on the line, trusting that the vast network of command, intelligence, and communication was working to keep them alive. And it had failed them in the most catastrophic way imaginable. They were just a tiny, expendable cog, and a mistake made miles away could snuff them out in an instant. As they stood there, 5 men silhouetted against their own funeral pyre, a new, harder resolve began to form. Their circle of trust, which had always been small, now shrank to include only the 5 of them. They couldn't rely on the generals, the intelligence reports, or even the planes in the sky. They could rely only on the man to their left and the man to their right. They were no longer just a crew in the US Army. They were a tribe of survivors, an independent entity bound by fire and a shared sense of betrayal. Their loyalty was no longer to a flag or a cause in the abstract, but to each other in the starkest and most absolute terms. When the dust settled, the army, with its impersonal efficiency, simply issued them another tank. It was their 3rd Sherman. Mechanically, it was identical to the others. But spiritually, it was a different beast entirely. As they took a can of white paint and once again stenciled the words "in the mood" on the gun barrel, the meaning had changed forever. It was no longer a jaunty expression of optimism. It was an act of pure, stubborn defiance. It was a middle finger to the Germans, to the sheer chaos of combat, and even to the friendly fire that had tried to erase them. The name was no longer a song. It was a scar, a creed, a promise to each other that they alone would determine their fate. They had now stared into the abyss twice and walked away. They had survived the cunning of the enemy and the incompetence of their friends. This 3rd tank, this 3rd life, felt different. They were operating on borrowed time, and they knew it. Hardened by a betrayal of fire, they were now more focused, more ruthless, and more reliant on their own small band of brothers than ever before. They had been to hell and back, twice. But the final, and most formidable, test of their legend was still waiting for them, hidden on the road to the Siegfried Line. The breakout from the Normandy hedgerows was like a dam, bursting. After weeks of claustrophobic, grinding warfare, the 3rd Armored Division was finally unleashed. And at the very tip of this steel spearhead was Lafayette Pool and the 3rd incarnation of "in the mood." What followed was a lightning advance across France and Belgium, a blur of conquered towns and shattered enemy formations. For Poole and his pups, this was the war they were made for. Open country, fluid movement, and clear lines of sight here. Their aggressive, coordinated tactics were not just effective, they were devastating. Their kill count, already impressive, began to climb at a staggering pace. They became a whirlwind of destruction, a self-contained storm of cannon fire and machine gun chatter. A German artillery battery of 88 seconds, the dreaded tank killers, was silenced before it could fire a shot. A German supply convoy, caught on an open road, was systematically annihilated. During one legendary engagement, they were credited with destroying 3 German armored vehicles and clearing out an enemy-held town, all in the space of an hour. They fought with a furious, almost joyful efficiency, fueled by their shared history of survival and betrayal. They were no longer just fighting for their country, they were fighting for each other, a tribe of 5 against the German army. It was during this relentless push that the legend of War Daddy was truly cemented. The name, perhaps spoken in jest at first, became their official call sign, and it wasn't just the Americans who knew it. Their uncanny ability to appear at the most critical moment, to turn the tide of a local skirmish, or to spearhead an assault through a heavily defended position, did not go unnoticed by the enemy. German intelligence began to piece together reports of a single, hyper-aggressive Sherman tank that seemed to be everywhere at once, leaving a trail of wreckage in its wake. They had become a priority target. The hunters, in their fame, had become the most sought-after prey, on the Western Front. Back at the highest levels of the Allied command, another kind of attention was being paid. In the sterile, map-lined rooms far from the fighting, Lafayette Poole was no longer just a staff sergeant. He was a statistic, a phenomenon, a story. And stories were a valuable wartime commodity. With an unparalleled record and a rugged, all-American background, he was the perfect hero. The gears of the vast propaganda machine began to turn. The decision was made. Sergeant Poole was too valuable an asset to risk losing. His story could sell millions in war bonds, boost morale on the home front, and put a heroic face on the brutal, anonymous grind of the war. The orders came down through the chain of command, jarring and unwelcome. Staff. Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole and his crew were to be immediately withdrawn from combat. They were heroes, and they were to be sent home. For any other crew, after months of hellish fighting and 2 near-death experiences, such an order would have been a reprieve, a winning lottery ticket, a miracle. For the men of In the Mood, it felt like a punishment. It felt like a betrayal. The conflict it created in Poole was immense. His entire life was now inside that turret. His identity was inextricably linked to the 4 men who fought beside him. They had been forged into a single entity in the fires of Villiers-Fossard and Fromental. The idea of leaving them, of standing on a stage in a clean, pressed uniform, talking about their exploits while they were still out there, risking death every single day, was unthinkable. It was a violation of their code, a betrayal of the sacred trust that had kept them alive. To go home to safety while his family was still at war was not a reward. It was an act of abandonment. His wife Evelyn's letters, which he read and reread until the paper was soft and worn, spoke of a peaceful future, a life waiting for him beyond the war. The orders were a direct path to that future, a guaranteed ticket to keeping his promise to her. But to accept it meant breaking a different, unspoken promise, the one he had made to the men who entrusted their lives to his command. He was caught between 2 families, 2 promises, 2 worlds. And so, Lafayette Poole made a fateful decision. He didn't openly defy the order. He didn't protest or argue. He did something far more subtle and ultimately far more consequential. He stalled. He acknowledged the order, but then found reasons to delay its execution. "We need to support the infantry on this next objective," he would argue. "Let us just get the company to the next town." With each objective taken, with each new mile gained, he would find another reason to stay for one more mission. It was a quiet, personal rebellion, driven not by ego, but by a profound sense of loyalty. He would not leave his men, not yet. He would see them to the edge of Germany, to the formidable Siegfried Line. Then, and only then, would his job be done. This decision hung in the air as they rolled ever eastward into the autumn chill of the German frontier. They were now, quite literally, living on borrowed time, not just from fate, but from their own high command. A strange tension settled over the crew. They were a ghost crew, officially slated for removal from the battlefield, yet still fighting on the bloody edge of the war. Every sunrise was a gift. Every successful engagement felt like a stay of execution. They were racing against their own legend, trying to outrun the destiny that their fame had created for them. Poole's choice to remain with his men was a testament to his character, the ultimate act of a leader who puts his soldiers first. But heroic choices in wartime often lead to tragic consequences. Was this unwavering loyalty the very thing that sealed his fate? By choosing to defy the safety of home for one last push with his brothers in arms, had he inadvertently steered them all towards a final, inescapable rendezvous with the destiny that had been hunting them all along? The answer lay waiting, in the quiet, rubble-strewn streets of a small German village called Musterbusch. The story comes full circle. We are back on September 19th, 1944, in the chilling, unnatural silence of Musterbusch. Every tense moment, every hard-won victory, every ghost of the past 81 days has led Lafayette Poole and his men to this quiet, unassuming street. The order to stay safe was a hollow echo in Pool's mind, drowned out by the primal scream of his own intuition. He knew, in the way a farmer knows a storm is coming long before the first drop of rain, he knew they were in a trap. The third, in the mood, rolled forward, its engine a low, nervous growl in the stillness, each turn of the treads marking a slow, deliberate countdown to a fate he could feel but could not see. The crew was a coiled spring. Inside the steel hull, the air was thick with unspoken fear. They had absolute faith in their commander, and if Poole was spooked, they were terrified. Richard's hands were slick with sweat on the controls. Boggs stood ready by the breech, an armored piercing round held in his powerful hands. In the gunner's seat, the replacement, Paul King, scanned the rubble-strewn landscape through his periscope, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was meant to be their last, easiest day of the war. Instead, it felt like the end of the world. Then, they saw it. Or rather, they didn't. It was a flicker of movement, a shadow within a shadow, a subtle disturbance in a shattered storefront that didn't belong. A masterfully camouflaged German Panther tank lay in wait, perfectly positioned for an ambush. It hadn't made a sound. Its crew had waited with the infinite patience of a spider in its web, watching the American Sherman crawl directly into its pre-sighted kill zone. They had let them come, waiting for the perfect, unmissable shot. The world erupted in a flash of white-hot light, and a sound that was more of a physical concussion than a noise. The Panther's 75mm cannon fired. The shell, a streak of hypersonic death, shrieked past their turret, missing by mere inches. It detonated against a building behind them, showering the Sherman in a rain of brick and mortar. The near miss was a brutal confirmation of their worst fears. Poole's premonition was real. They were caught. There was no time for tactics, no room for a clever flanking maneuver. This was not a boxer's dance. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. Gunner, traverse left. Target, tank in the building. Fire. Poole roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. But the German crew was a mirror image of their own efficiency. They were veterans, professionals, and they were faster. Before King could lay his crosshairs on the target, the Panther fired again. This time, the shell did not miss. It struck the Sherman's turret with the force of a meteor, a catastrophic impact that sent a shockwave of energy through the entire vehicle. The sound was indescribable, the shriek of protesting steel, the deafening crack of penetrated armor, and the explosive roar of the shell detonating inside the cramped fighting compartment. The world dissolved into a blinding flash, a vortex of fire, smoke, and flying, red-hot shrapnel. For the men inside, it was the apocalypse. The kinetic force of the impact was a brutal, physical blow. Private First Class Paul King, the young replacement gunner, was killed instantly, his war ending in a fraction of a second without his ever knowing what had happened. He had been in the crew for only a few days, a random pawn sacrificed by the cruel whims of fate. Lafayette Poole was thrown violently against the commander's hatch. He felt a searing, unbelievable pain tear through his right leg. He looked down and saw a mangled ruin of blood, bone, and cloth. A piece of shrapnel from the exploding shell had torn through the steel and nearly severed his leg from his body. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that for a moment he felt nothing but a strange, disconnected cold. Then the pain hit, a tidal wave of pure agony that threatened to swallow his consciousness. The third in the mood was a charnel house, filled with the acrid smoke of its own death. Through the haze of pain and chaos, the survival instinct of the remaining crew took over. Richards, Boggs, and Close, battered and bruised but miraculously alive, knew they had seconds to escape before the ammunition cooked off and blew the tank to pieces. They scrambled for the hatches, their training screaming at them to get out, get clear, save themselves. But as they tumbled out onto the street, into a hail of German machine gun fire from the now advancing infantry, they did something that defied all logic and training. They looked back at the burning wreck of their tank and realized their commander was not with them. Their leader, the man who had dragged them through hell and back twice, the man who had defied orders to stay with them, was still inside. In that moment, a bond forged in 81 days of unrelenting combat, transcended the instinct for self-preservation. They were not leaving their family behind. Under a curtain of suppressing fire, with bullets pinging off the rubble around them, they turned back. Close laid down, covering fire with his Thompson submachine gun, while Richards and Boggs clambered back onto the smoking hull of the Sherman. They reached into the turret through the thick, choking smoke and grabbed their wounded commander. Poole was a dead weight, semi-conscious and bleeding profusely. With adrenaline-fueled strength, they dragged him out of the hatch and onto the deck of the tank. The German Panther, seeing movement, fired its coaxial machine gun, stitching lines of fire across the steel around them. Ignoring the danger, they wrestled Poole's broken body off the tank and dragged him behind the meager cover of its burning chassis. The dream was over. The legend was broken. The incredible 81-day saga of Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole and his crew had ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in a desperate, bloody retreat. Their third and final tank was an inferno. One of their brothers was dead, and their war daddy, the seemingly immortal spearhead of the 3rd Armored Division, was now just a critically wounded soldier, his life bleeding out onto the dirty cobblestones of a forgotten German town. The price for their incredible record, for their legendary status, had finally been presented, and it was a debt to be paid in blood, in brotherhood, and in the unbearable cost of sacrifice. Lafayette Poole survived. He was pulled from the battlefield, a broken man saved by the unshakable loyalty of his crew, but his war was over. The journey that followed was not one of triumphant parades and cheering crowds, but a long, agonizing battle, fought in sterile hospital wards. The surgeons did what they could, but the damage was too catastrophic. His right leg had to be amputated high above the knee. The farmer who once strode across the Texas plains and the boxer who had danced in the ring would have to learn to walk again. The physical pain was immense, but it was perhaps eclipsed by the psychological torment. The phantom pains, the loss of his identity as a frontline warrior, and the constant, replaying loop of the final, violent moments in Musterbusch. In the aftermath, those who knew his record were in awe. His commanding officers, recognizing that they had witnessed a feat of arms for the ages, recommended him for the highest honor his country could bestow, the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was filed, detailing the destruction of 258 enemy vehicles, the 81 days of continuous combat, and the unwavering leadership that had inspired all who served with him. It seemed a certainty, but the vast, impersonal machinery of the military bureaucracy, which had once tried to send him home for his own safety, delivered one final, cruel blow. The nomination was denied. The reason given was a stunning example of bureaucratic rigidity. The Medal of Honor, the review board argued, was intended for individual acts of valor. A tank, they reasoned, was a crew-served weapon, and therefore its incredible achievements could not be attributed to a single man. The collective nature of his heroism, the very teamwork he had championed and perfected, was used as a technicality to deny him the recognition he so clearly deserved. It was a profound injustice, a final, bitter irony in a story already filled with them. He was given the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award, but the ultimate honor remained elusive, lost in a fog of red tape. For a lesser man, this combination of crippling injury, institutional slight would have been a bitter end. But Lafayette Poole was not a lesser man. The same indomitable will that had driven him through the hedgerows now fueled his recovery. He battled through the pain, endured the grueling physical therapy, and mastered the use of his prosthetic leg. And then he did something that left his doctors and superiors speechless. He requested to return to active duty. He fought the Army's attempts to medically discharge him, arguing that his mind was still a weapon and his experience was too valuable to lose. Incredibly, he won. Lafayette War Daddy Poole, the one-legged tanker, re-enlisted and served for another 15 years, becoming a revered instructor, passing on the hard-won lessons of combat to a new generation of American tankers. He refused to be defined by what he had lost. He returned home to Evelyn, the wife who had been his anchor, and together They built the life he had dreamed of in his letters. He fulfilled his promise. He came home. They raised a family, including a son, Lafayette G. Poole Jr., who grew up in the long shadow of his father's legend. But the echoes of war are cruel and have a long reach. The price that war demanded from the Poole family, it turned out, was not yet fully paid. Decades after Lafayette Poole's own war had ended, a new conflict was raging in the jungles of Southeast Asia. His son, following in his father's footsteps of service, had become an officer in the United States Marine Corps. In 1970, First Lieutenant Lafayette G. Poole Jr. was killed in action in Vietnam. The news was a devastating blow, a tragedy that cast a permanent shadow over the hero's life. The man who had survived 3 tanks being shot out from under him, who had cheated death countless times, now had to face a parent's worst nightmare, a loss from which there is no recovery. The war had finally found a way to break his heart. His own incredible story of survival was now framed by a much larger, more profound story of generational sacrifice. The cost of war, for the Poole family, was not 1 leg. It was 2 lives. Lafayette Poole passed away in 1991, a quiet end for a man whose life had been defined by such violent sound and fury. His legacy, however, is anything but quiet. It is written into the training manuals of the U.S. Army Armor School. It is memorialized in a monument at Fort Knox. It thunders across the screen in the 2014 film Fury, for which his exploits and the unbreakable bond of his crew served as a primary inspiration. He proved, beyond any doubt, a timeless military truth, that the quality of the soldiers will always triumph over the quality of their equipment. He proved that leadership, teamwork, and audacious courage are the ultimate force multipliers on any battlefield. His story leaves us with a profound and unsettling question. It forces us to examine what we value and how we measure a hero's worth. Here was a man who achieved one of the greatest combat records in American history, a leader who never left his men, who survived unimaginable trauma, and who bore the ultimate family sacrifice. And yet, the highest medal for valor was denied to him. So, the question we leave you with is this: what is the true measure of a hero? Is it the polished medals that a bureaucracy decides to award, often decades after the fact? Or is it the legacy of lives saved, of battles won, and the quiet, unbreakable courage to face not just the enemy in front of you, but the personal tragedies that follow you home? Lafayette War Daddy Poole never received the Medal of Honor, but his story asks if, perhaps, he earned something far greater. Share your thoughts in the comments below.